A compressor allows us to decrease the dynamic range of a sound. Dynamic range is the difference between the loudest and lowest part of a sound. If we take a look at the sound here, it's a punch, kind of one of those slap punches that you create by hitting one hand with the other. And it creates something very slappy. So just by nature of being what it is, a transient sound, that first moment is going to be quite loud compared to what comes after it. So we lower the gain of the recorder to accommodate this, and therefore everything that comes after is quite low. What a compressor can do is it can help to minimize this peak of the transient and make this lower, so that way what follows could be brought up louder and we could hear more of the character and texture of the sound. So to do this, I'm going to open up a compressor. I'm going to use an audio suite because it's easier to render it and see what the waveform looks like after we render the compressor. So I'm going to Dynamics and Dyne 3 compressor limiter. This is the free compressor that comes with all versions of Pro Tools, and it's a pretty good compressor. If we take a look at the compressor, there are 5 controls that I'm going to pay some attention to in talking about this, and that's going to be the threshold, which we can adjust here, or we can adjust it over here. The ratio, attack, and release. And we're also going to talk about the gain. So first, the threshold. The threshold is the point at which we start compressing the sound. You want to think about compression as, I'll just bring up a fader for illustration, a fader that whenever the sound hits the threshold, brings the level down, just brings it right up whenever we pass this threshold. So if we set our threshold at this level, this peak right here, when this plays through, the compressor brings the fader down, and as soon as we get to here, this all happens very, very quickly, the fader jumps back up. So we just bring down this one point. That's kind of what's going on behind the scenes in the compressor. So the threshold determines at what point that fader starts going down. The ratio is going to determine how far down that fader is going to go. In other words, how much gain reduction we're going to apply. The attack is going to determine how quickly that fader comes down. So if the attack is very quick, it's going to go down very quickly. If it's slower attack, when the threshold gets triggered, this goes down a little bit slower. Okay, it doesn't zip down quickly, it goes down a little slower. Still pretty fast. I mean, 1.9 milliseconds is still pretty fast. And then there's the release, which is how quickly this fader returns back to the 0 point. And again, if it's a quick release, it'll go back up really quickly. Or if it's a slower release, it'll go back up a little more slowly. Still, again, 245 milliseconds is relatively quick. Let's apply some compression. I'm going to start with the threshold all the way up, and let's set the reduction to about 10. So now as this plays, you see here's the threshold. Again, I can control with this as well, or I can drag the arrow. Threshold is all the way up here, and the sound is not hitting the threshold. So nothing's happening. There's no gain reduction. There's no little fader inside of this that's going up and down. So I'm going to lower this as it plays, so this hits the threshold. And I'm also going to lower the attack and release for now. Okay, you'll notice the gain reduction light is going on. And if we look in this graphical display up here, you'll see as I bring the threshold down, that's this orange line. Here is where the gain reduction is happening. And we could hear it as well. You could hear that initial transient of the slap. Gets a little softer. So let's render this and see what happens. Okay, so we can see we basically lowered that initial transient. Basically took off that snappiness of it. What we want to do is we want to compensate for the volume that we're losing from this. It's going to appear lower. So what we can do is we can bring the gain up. If I bypass it, you can hear that slap there when I take it out. Now I'll bring the gain up. So it kind of sounds, so you can hear that there's the slap before the compression. That's with the compression. Because we're lowering this and bringing up the gain, all of this gets brought up. So let's render this and see what it looks like. So now it's not that small waveform, it's a larger, louder waveform, and it has a lot more texture than that. So let's go a little farther with this and look at the attack and the release. So as I said, the attack is how quickly that fader that's inside of this compressor pushes this down. So if I make the attack a little bit slower, a little bit of this transient is going to get through. So let me give it a slower attack. So I'm going to bring the gain down again. And let's render this. All right, so you can see we're allowing some of that transient through by having a slower attack. So that fader is a little slower coming down, so some of these transients get through. Now let's take a look at the release. So release is how quickly that fader lets go of being pushed down and goes back up again. And that could change the tonality of sound. You can hear what happens when I adjust this. Here's before. Here's after. Try to balance the gain a little more. I'll render this so you can see what happened now. Here's before, and as we render this, we allow a little bit of that initial transient through. This gets brought down a little bit, and we hear a lot more of the ending, giving it more texture, making it sound more like a Hollywood punch.